Hello, welcome to Grafana's Big Tent. I'm Matt Ryer. This is the podcast all about the people, community, tools, and tech around observability. I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Tom Wilkie. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Matthew. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks. Yeah, feeling good about this episode. Are you?
This is the first one I've been on for season 3, so yeah, excited to be back.
Yeah, welcome back. And it's about Prometheus 3.0. You've used Prometheus before, haven't you?
Just a little bit, yeah. We were trying to remember, Julius and I were trying to remember the first time I used it and we met, and it's probably the best part of 10 years I've been using Prometheus.
That's amazing. We're also joined by Richi Hartmann. Hello, Richi. Also Grafana Labs, aren't you?
No.
Man of few words.
I'm German.
You're German. Okay. Thanks for telling us that. That actually is good to know going into this. We're also joined by Julius Volz. Julius, are you also German?
I'm also German. I can say a few more words than Richi, but not that many more.
Okay, good. So it sounds like we've got ourselves a podcast then, at least.
Yep.
Julius, you are the co-creator of Prometheus, which is kind of cool. And you're also at PromLabs at the moment. Just quickly, for anyone that doesn't know Prometheus, what is it and where did it come from and why does it exist?
Yeah, sure. So Prometheus is a metrics-based monitoring system in time series database, and it came about as a hobby project. So it was the year 2012. I came from Google to SoundCloud, moving from Zurich to Berlin. And at the same time, Matt Proud also had done the same move, but from a different Google office. We didn't know each other. We were tasked with making SoundCloud more reliable. SoundCloud was always down, slow, unreliable, all these things. Already had a cluster scheduler, self-built in-house, very improvised, and couldn't really monitor all the things going on there in a proper way anymore with the existing monitoring tools in the open source world. So both Matt and I, we really started missing the monitoring tool that we had at Google called Borgmon. And so over a couple of months, we always came back to that same realization. If we want to improve things, we need to have better insight, better visibility, or nowadays you would maybe say observability, religious topic. And yeah, eventually we just started building what then became Prometheus in our free time, and then more and more in SoundCloud time. And then eventually Prometheus was mature enough and documented enough and had enough components in its ecosystem, metrics exporters and so on, that we decided to fully publish it, both as an open source project, but also with a blog post from SoundCloud explaining what it is about. A year later, we joined the CNCF as the second project after Kubernetes. So it's all under an open governance now. Many companies working under an open governance on Prometheus together to make it a better and better monitoring system. And yeah, the way you can imagine it, right? It collects metrics about your applications, your infrastructure, anything really that can emit metrics. And then you gather those metrics, and then you have a query language called PromQL with which you can do useful things with that collected data. You can wake yourself up at 3 a.m. in the night if either, the database is down or your wind park isn't generating power anymore or there's something slow. Or you can have nice charts. You can do ad hoc debugging. You can do capacity planning. You can do anything you do with numeric metrics, basically. So that's Prometheus in a nutshell.
Nice. It's a similar founding story, I guess, to Backstage and Spotify, right? An internal tool becomes this popular external open source project. Did you ever have conversations at SoundCloud about SoundCloud actually offering this as a product or offering this as services around it? Because I realize Spotify has started doing that with Backstage now.
Oh, never. No, not at all. No, I think also in the first years of SoundCloud, very understandably so, most people at SoundCloud were at first kind of wondering, why are you building a monitoring system? That's not what we hired you for. And that's a kind of ludicrous idea. And honestly, if I had been my own manager back then, I maybe would have told myself, cut it out or you'll be fired. But we were lucky and it worked out. And of course, we put in a lot of work to make it work. Eventually, we kind of reached a tipping point internally where both politically and technically, everything was working well enough and accepted well enough that people actually said, okay, every new service has to be monitored with Prometheus now, because it's really changing the way we work with metrics and visibility in our services. But still, SoundCloud is in such a different type of business, right? That they never even had the idea of let's like do a business around Prometheus. They were very generous though, allowing us to kind of really separate it out of SoundCloud, although we had spent that much SoundCloud work time on it, like, just allowing us to fully release it into the CNCF and all that. That was really cool. Nice. Yeah.
What is it about music streaming companies building open source infrastructure projects though, like Spotify and SoundCloud?
That is a very good idea. Very good question. Someone should look into that.
Yeah. Wonder what we're going to get out of Apple Music. It's not going to be fast UIs, is it? So one thing that struck me when I first encountered Prometheus many years ago was that it was just a sort of text-based format. It's just when you get the metrics, it's just sort of text. And that always strikes me as either very naive or someone's really thought about this. Which one was it, Julius?
Obviously, someone really thought about it. No, but yeah. I think that it is true. So there's like multiple layers of history to this. If you look at what Borgmon did internally at Google at the time, there was also text-based format. Though curiously, the first version of Prometheus actually used the JSON format. Like the very first alpha, pre-alpha, like let's test something, let's get something going was JSON, which kind of really didn't work too well because you need to like parse the entire JSON body very inefficiently and all that, and didn't work too well. And then eventually we came up with both a protobuf format and a text-based format. And then with Prometheus 2, the protobuf format was kind of ditched in favor of, hey, this text format actually works really, really well. It's also really highly optimized in the ingestion path, where we like try to not allocate any memories for metrics we've already seen and so on. And the really nice thing about this format is the low barrier of entry. So you can even emit it from a shell script, from whatever weird environment that doesn't have a full, stack for modern programming languages. You really only need to serve something that looks like a very primitive HTTP endpoint outputting a few ASCII characters, and that's it. And then you can get metrics out of that thing, whatever it happens to be, with a Prometheus server. And that is in contrast to, try doing protobuf from, a shell script or some embedded processor or so. So I think that actually really helped Prometheus as well, because it made it really easy for anyone to expose metrics from anything they cared about.
I'm glad you brought up proto buffers there, right? Because two things on that, right? One is like they're coming back though.
They're coming back.
With the new native histograms. But also, have you seen the HyperPB stuff from the buff.build team?
What is that?
HyperPB, it's the new just-in-time data-driven proto part. Oh, I haven't used it yet. I've only seen it on Hacker News in the past few days. But it looks really exciting. It's supposed to be like 10 times faster than even like generated code, which obviously Go doesn't do. So I really want to check it out for the remote write path, where we're still very proto heavy and it's still a bit of a bottleneck.
Yeah, some other protocols there do use protobuf, and maybe for completeness sake, protobuf for actual metrics ingestion from monitored services or targets is making a comeback. As we're still always going to support the text-based protocol, but Prometheus is getting this new type of metric called a native histogram, and it has very fine-grained buckets, and so it is way more efficient to transfer it in a binary-based, well-structured format than like integrating that somehow into the old text format. So that was the main motivation to bring back some kind of proto-based scraping format. But again, it is optional. You don't have to use it if you want to get metrics into Prometheus.
Yeah, cool. So, Richi, do you remember when you first used Prometheus or encountered it?
October 2015.
Thank you.
Do you remember the date and the exact day and time?
You don't remember what time? I can't believe it.
The first week of October of 2015, if you want to be precise, because I switched jobs.
Yeah.
What was the first page you got from Prometheus?
I think it was one of the Kubernetes, one of the early prototype Kubernetes alerts.
I'm pretty certain it was disk or TLS certificate lifetime with a predict linear.
Richi, you always came to this very much not from the cloud native side, right? But from monitoring data centers and hardware and networks.
Yes.
Good. I'm glad you expanded on that.
No, I mean, if you keep asking yes, no questions, no, but that's actually that's what I really liked about Prometheus. Historically, a lot of the old stuff used to work. I mean, some more, some less, but it used to work by and large, but it wasn't exactly made for scale. And as such, a lot of the time, stuff was just put into an image and that was the end of it. Like basically the storage, which you could access as an end user was more or less just an image
You're talking about legacy monitoring systems before Prometheus, right?
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yes, I was. And it kind of worked, but Prometheus had to be built for something of much larger scale and being able to analyze data in more or less arbitrary settings, which came with the deliberately exposed complexity of cloud. And this is something which really, really stuck with me and basically made me fall in love with Prometheus overnight, because for the first time in my life, I was able to actually do math on my data and not just see it and done. I could actually work on and with the data and take it further. And that's super useful within cloud and also with all the stuff you can still touch.
And like, I think it's a common misconception that Prometheus and Kubernetes kind of grew up together, came from the same place, were built to work together. I mean, they do work incredibly well together, right? But, you know, actually, as we were chatting about this beforehand, the Kubernetes integrations in Prometheus came relatively late. Like, I think if you say 2012 is when you start working on Prometheus, right? It was 3 years before the Kubernetes service discovery was added, Julius?
Well, yes, but we only announced Prometheus to the world in January of 2015. And very shortly after, people from Red Hat, Jimmy Dyson it was back then, added service discovery for Kubernetes. And then also very soon, all the Kubernetes components, Kubernetes API server, etcd, and so on, kubelet, all added native Prometheus metrics. So there was immediately or very soon great cross-compatibility between the two systems. And yes, it's true that the two systems kind of evolved completely separately without first knowing about each other. But on the other hand, they both kind of, Kubernetes is inspired by Google's Borg cluster scheduler, and then Prometheus was inspired by Google's Borgmon, so the tool to monitor services on Borg and to monitor the Borg clusters themselves. So it makes sense that they would work very well together philosophically with a label-based data model and the, service discovery and all that.
And that, I guess, is kind of, in the early days, I remember trying to explain the whole idea of Prometheus to people and service discovery and pull and, these kind of things. And it was alien because, dynamically scheduled environments were relatively new and few and far between. But that, I've always seen that as like the real killer set of features in Prometheus that still no one has recreated.
Yes, and I would say, if you read the latest article on my blog, why I still recommend native Prometheus instrumentation versus OpenTelemetry that is one of the main points, right? If you have a monitoring system or you want to have a monitoring system, in my opinion, it should know which monitored services should exist and then check whether they do actually send data. And Prometheus solves that by combining service discovery with a pull-based model. Hey, first I discover everything that should exist in the world, and then I actively go out and try to pull from it. And if I can't, I will record that in a metric that tells me, hey, this target is down. And I have built-in easy health alerting. And that is unfortunately something, despite all the benefits of OTel, one thing that currently kind of just got dropped on the floor when you just push metrics to, you treat your monitoring system as a receptacle for random metrics, as I would say. How does Prometheus or whatever monitoring system you're pushing to still know whether any data is not coming in and all that? So I think that is really a concern that Prometheus addressed really well for the first time, and still there's not many other solutions that actually even think about that problem or handle it in the way that Prometheus does.
I mean, it's still, I think, probably actually back to your question about what was the first alert. I think actually an alert on the up metric was probably my first alert I received.
So hold on then, Prometheus 3.0, when was the last release? And why is it taking so long? Julius, what if you type with both hands? It's been 7 years since 2.0?
Yeah, 7 years. When was the 2.0 release? Was it in 2016 or 17? Does anyone remember?
We talked with PlanetCom in 2016 in Seattle about their pod lifetimes, and this is part of what triggered Prometheus 2.0. So I suspect it would have been 2017.
Well, the official Prometheus blog post says it was 7 years ago. So I'm going.
Okay, let's go with 7 years. Yeah, I mean, here, of course, we can really say how stable we've been, right? We really actually, we're an infrastructure project. We want to be somewhat conservative. We want to be adopted and trusted by people. So we actually managed to, let's say, finalize or build enough things into Prometheus 2 that were well thought out enough to survive for 7 years without having to be broken, which is really nice for users. And we made it really clear in a documentation page which elements of the Prometheus API surface are stable. And then there's, of course, always been a few things, the UI can change in various ways and so on that are not declared stable. But mostly that has meant that for the past 7 years, people could just get a new version of Prometheus, just start it without thinking, and it just keeps working, except if there's a bug. And then, of course, we started accumulating more and more smaller things and a few bigger things that we did want to actually change in a breaking way in Prometheus. And then eventually there came the idea for Prometheus 3. And then, it happened at the end of last year. So, yeah, I think let's see how long it takes until the next major release now, right? Could be that we say something like, hey, let's just bump the major release whenever we have a few breaking changes that we actually want to make, but also could be that we say, hey, the signaling is actually nice if the major release doesn't change all the time, because people, don't get this fatigue of having to check whether they need to change any settings and so on.
I mean, it's like the Linux versioning, right? Like how long did the 2. something Linux tree run for? Like I think, it was a huge number in the end.
Long time. Yeah.
Now they just bump the major version almost on a regular schedule, I believe, right? So we're somewhere between that, I think.
Yeah, I like the way Go does this too, the 1.0 backwards compatibility promise of the language, because I think it's that stability that allows people to build on top of these as foundations. So yeah, a lot of respect for these long major release cycles, for sure. So what are you most excited about 3.0? Richi, are you excited?
Yes and no. So part of 3.0 was more of evolution, less of absolutely breaking everything and redoing the world. My own personal favorite is probably performance, because even though it is such a long-running program and such a long-running project, and even though we have made major improvements over the years, we were still able to massively improve the overall performance. Both CPU and memory. It was between, I think, 3 to 7x in our tests, like between early 2.x versions and 3.x. So contrary to a lot of other software, in particular end-user facing, which just becomes slower and more expensive and just more of a memory hog over time, we actually act out more performance in something which is just vital to most businesses these days.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because this is used in so many places, the impact of those performance improvements is kind of enormous when you think about it.
Yeah, but I love that Prometheus is getting faster and more efficient, but I also feel like people are just using it, throwing more and more metrics into it. Like if we're 4 times better with memory, people are just throwing 4 times as much metrics into it, right? Like, there's definitely this attitude of just add a metric for everything because Prometheus can handle it. And whilst that's brilliant, it's also kind of leading to a huge volume of metrics.
Yep. So of course the performance wasn't all directly related to Prometheus 3, right? That's an ongoing effort that is happening all the time, which is amazing. And then also I would say a lot of the major cool features that we highlighted as being part of Prometheus 3 were not strictly breaking, right? So there were a few breaking things really that aren't even worth mentioning, like a couple of like deprecated flags and this and that, but no major thing really went away. So like most Prometheus users can still even just upgrade from 2 to 3 without having to think much. Maybe if they're using some, very arcane flag, they have to change something. But mostly they're getting a couple of cool new features. So personally, I worked on just revamping the old UI. The old UI was, it was built on like an outdated version of Bootstrap, very outdated under the hood, very cluttered because people just added random UI elements to every page in a very uncoordinated manner over many years. And I felt it would be a little bit sad to release Prometheus 3 with something that still looked like a garbage dump, basically. So basically, created a new UI, still based on React, based on the Mentine UI React component framework. And then also, so basically tried to make the pages look more consistent, a bit more cleaned, and also add some new features like the PromLens style tree view, which means if you enter a PromQL query, you can enable a tree view which shows you in a tree-like layout the structure of your query and which data you have at which sub-expression. You can click on sub-expressions, you can get explanations for them, see the data at each sub-expression, and these kind of new features that a revamp of the UI enabled. So I would say that is maybe one of the highlights. We had a few other things. We had Remote Write 2.0. So Remote Write is this protocol that the Prometheus server can send to some other remote endpoint, let's say a cloud service that stores your metrics. So it's kind of a Prometheus server. It's meant for a Prometheus server to forward metrics to some either long-term storage or other processing system that wants to do further stuff with your metrics. And this new version of the remote write protocol has more support for metadata, trace exemplars, the new native histograms, and more. And then it's also more efficient. So that's that could be interesting for some people. And then, of course, the big thing. Should I go on about the OTel stuff, or does anyone?
No, I think the unsung hero of Prometheus 3.0 is UTF-8 support. And I know that might not be the most exciting for most people, but we talked about kind of the things that make Prometheus different, right? We talked about pull and we talked about service discovery, but there was also something in Prometheus very early days of not using the dot as the kind of separator in the names for metrics, right?
I'm still against that, but
you're still against it, right? So Prometheus had the underscores, and this was intentional, right, Julius? This was intentional to separate ourselves from the hierarchical way of doing metrics.
Yeah. Also, yes.
I feel like there's a story there.
I would have to think about it a little bit. But the dot operator specifically was also just not used initially because we always had the idea of potentially using it as an actual operator, similar to how it was used, for example, in Borgmon there you could say like metric name dot the name of the job, and it would be like an implicit label selector on the job name. But that never materialized. And then over the years, there were more and more other ideas for how to potentially use the dot as an operator at some point. But then eventually we had long discussions about that, and it never happened. But we also did not allow a lot of other characters in metric names and label names because we have a query language, which, like most programming languages, has to care about character escaping issues and things that look like an operator but aren't, but really are just like part of a metric name, can really throw a wrench into that. So if you think about most programming languages, they do not allow a dot as part of a variable name, or a slash or a minus, because those are operators. And so, I think Tom, talk about the UTF-8 support, and then maybe also what that means for people who want to use it in terms of PromQL selectors.
Yeah, the PromQL is still a bit clunky with names with funny characters in, but I also think like the adoption of UTF-8 for label values and for metric names, which are just label values, right? I think it's huge for interoperability, right? Because the experience before, using before was your metrics were not called the same thing in Prometheus as they were in the legacy system you were migrating from, or as they were in OpenTelemetry, or as they were just in other things. And this was a huge barrier for a lot of people, I think. Like, I just think this really sets the tone that Prometheus 3.0 is much more open to wider usage beyond the kind of hyper opinionated Prometheus observability community, or Prometheus monitoring community. So I think it's more that this is why I'm excited about it, because honestly, like, there's a lot of people using OpenTelemetry. There's a lot of people using, old legacy HP OpenView and all these other systems that just want something more modern, more cost effective, more scalable, more usable. And yet this is honestly like a massive barrier for them.
Yeah, makes total sense. So yeah, now you can put any characters you like into your metric names and into your label names.
Label names? Label names have it
label
as well.
names
So I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And label values already were arbitrary strings before. The only thing you have to watch out for if you do that, if you go beyond the traditionally allowed character set, is that you do have to quote more things in your PromQL selectors. So they will become a little bit more elaborate. But yeah, that's the cost of getting that nice unchanged
on that point, right?
metric name.
Like, how much do you think? I think PromQL is brilliant, and I live in the terminal day to day, which is weird because I'm not really a coder anymore. But like, I still do most of my work, on spreadsheets and Google Docs from the terminal. How long do you think this kind of very CLI first way of interacting with Prometheus and this query language first way of interacting Prometheus is going to persist? Because again, I think that's a sign of like the highly opinionated audience community that Prometheus is aimed at, and there's a massive community outside of that who want something more point and click. I mean, you built something point and click with PromLens, right? Like, there's definitely an audience for this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's a good question. And of course, there's LLMs and AI and all that stuff these days where probably in a few years, you'll talk English or you'll have like a brain interface to just ask. And then humans at some point, they're obsolete anyway.
It'll be super disturbing, the queries.
Yeah. No, but I mean, that's true to a degree. Of course, I think for quite a few years, there will still be many people who just write like tons of YAML with PromQL expressions in them and so on. But it's a good question, like how big each of the audiences are. And you're right, probably the audience that is more casual and just wants to get all their data into that and then somehow ask some intelligent system to give them something out without knowing full PromQL is probably even larger. Yeah, but I'm not sure.
I think the AI bit you raised there is kind of super interesting as well, because we're seeing more and more people interact with Grafana using the AI assistant. That did anyone on the call have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I was working on that.
You were working on that, Matt? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's quite good.
And I think one of the things we've been really impressed by is, and this is really a testament to the size of the Prometheus community and the amount of content that it generates out there, is like how well these foundation models generate PromQL. Like, surprisingly well. Like, they're not, especially in the last year or so, they've got really good at it. And so, like, I think that's just a testament to them being trained on the content generated by the huge Prometheus community, right?
Yeah.
Because they do that. The same cannot be said for other monitoring. So we even see them not as good as generating queries in LogQL, right? Loki's query language. Even though it's so similar to Prometheus, the community is much, much smaller. The content's much smaller.
Yeah, we even see the assistant trying to use PromQL and Prometheus where it probably shouldn't as well. Like, it was trying to just figure out what's this a percentage of the whole, because it can't really deal with numbers very well, but it knew it could generate PromQL, so it was using that to just do basic calculations. So yeah, but it's true. We've done a lot more work teaching it about LogQL and Prometheus, and also like best practices and all the conversations that people have had in the community about this in the past is all kind of there and it's taken into account. So we do find it be really good. I don't write any PromQL now. I will just ask the assistant and it will generate that for me.
I'm ashamed to admit that I'm falling into that. I mean, I'm pretty decent at PromQL. I used to be pretty decent at PromQL, I think. But now I'm just asking the assistant to do it. It's quite embarrassing.
That makes sense. I mean, also, I know how to build a web app, but yesterday I built a web application without writing one line of code, right? And I deployed it and it's working.
I was going to ask, did Prometheus 3.0 come about with the help of any sort of AI-guided coding tools or assistants?
GitHub Copilot, mostly. nothing too crazy. I mean, most of the time when I'm writing more serious code, I don't do, I don't generate like 10 different files automatically and then try to understand what was generated. It's still more autocomplete a few lines, understand everything, and then change the bits that need to be changed. But still, definitely, it's very helpful to have LLM-based coding assistants.
So let's talk a bit about OpenTelemetry. Sorry, I know I took us on a tangent there.
Well, hold on. Before we do, UTF-8, how long before people just have poop emojis in the
it's already happened.
Yeah, like that's the inevitable.
Of course.
That's the elephant in the room, right?
I think if you go and check our production services, there are UTF-8 characters now in the metric names.
Yeah, so it's going to be all emojis, isn't it, in the future? So, you happy with that, Julius?
Yeah. The poop emojis I fully support. Just quote your poop so it works.
Okay, that's the clip for the promo for the season. Yep. Thank you very much. Okay.
OpenTelemetry. Let's talk about the OpenTelemetry support. And I think UTF-8 was a big part of that. But like Richi, what else did Prometheus 3.0 bring from an OpenTelemetry perspective?
A lot in both ways. I mean, we invested quite some effort on both sides in increasing interoperability, because Prometheus kind of obviously has the largest installed base within all of Cloud Native. It's the only thing which kube-state metrics speaks, and there's basically anything which does metrics within CNCF is Prometheus native. Whereas a lot of the application and a lot of the mindshare for new stuff is with OpenTelemetry. And if those don't work together seamlessly, it's going to create a lot of friction, a lot of pain for everyone. So I would say that overall, with probably the exception of UTF-8, a lot more work had to be done on the OpenTelemetry side to be compatible with Prometheus rather than the other way around. But to be clear, there's still something which we from Prometheus team invested heavily in. Myself, Gautam, a few others, yourself, Tom, and also with I put on my Grafana hat for a second. Also, Grafana Labs is massively investing in with a lot of headcount and a lot of time and effort and engineers to make certain that OpenTelemetry is able to deliver on this promise of full interoperability with everything, which is one of the big draws of OpenTelemetry. Yeah, other things which we did for OpenTelemetry, or let's say with OpenTelemetry, is native histograms, for example. So native histograms is largely based on the work of Björn Rabenstein, and it is he called it his Magnus Opum himself. So he really poured a lot of time and energy into making this as near to perfect as is humanly possible. And anyone who has used the old histograms, so for those who don't or who didn't, the old histograms, basically you kind of needed to know how the system properties were to choose sane bucket boundaries for your histograms, whereas the native histograms just do what you want automatically, more or less. So you don't have this observe, improve cycle unless you were already a subject matter expert or had a rough inclination of what your data would look like. This is all not needed anymore with native histograms. And there was a specter on the horizon of OpenTelemetry also having something very close but slightly incompatible, similar with the initial histogram, which it happened there, and it cost a lot of pain and effort to fix this, in particular on the OpenTelemetry side. So native histograms is the first thing where before something even went stable, OpenTelemetry and Prometheus really collaborated closely and made it work before it got released as fully stable. And I feel this is less about Prometheus 3, more about just a change on both sides of the projects to really try and put something out which doesn't hurt or impede the users in ways which they cannot even anticipate before basically getting to at least semi-professional level with the thing.
I think I'm super excited about the native histograms as well. Like it is a big step forward, and I think it's quite also like a relatively unique approach that the Prometheus has done here, right? By storing the really high definition histograms, long term, right? My understanding is limited on this one, but my understanding is most other systems, whilst maybe using the high definition histograms for transport, like effectively sample and then only store the percentiles sampled. Like that's how I think most systems work. We store the full raw histogram, in a very, very efficient way forever, right? And so you can go in ad hoc in the in the future and ask arbitrary questions about like what was the performance on this date at this percentile, which if you didn't pre-sample and pre-store that, maybe you can't in other systems. Not an expert on this, but like that's my understanding. Is that accurate?
Yeah, as far as I know, yes. And also you're touching on a very important point. Prometheus is one of the few major projects which deals from everything from generating the data to transmitting the data to storing the data, querying it, using it for alerting, dashboarding, whatever. So the perspective of Prometheus on data handling is necessarily much more constrained is the wrong word, but needs to be more deliberate. Of course, it's not the case of just generating something, tossing it over the wall, and it's someone else's problem, or of being completely unable to determine how data is being generated. There is actually an underlying holistic design from beginning to end of or through the whole lifetime of a metric.
One of the things you said earlier was like that you don't need to be an expert on the underlying distribution of the data to use native histograms anymore. I think what you mean by that, right, is you don't have to pre-declare like a set number of buckets and think really hard about them, or use the wrong ones and then get, basically garbage data, right? But the system kind of just deals with that all for you now.
Yes.
Yeah. It's, I think this is huge. The other thing I think is so exciting about this is I think the number of hacky demos I've seen of native histograms that encode pictures in the histograms and videos. Like there's a smiley face, there's a Prometheus logo, but there's also Never Gonna Give You Up, right, as a video encoded in a native histogram that you can play back in Grafana, which I just think is such a cool, and also kind of shows like how much density and information you can pack into this data, right? The thing I've also really loved about the native histograms in production usage is we've actually learned a ton about the behavior of our services that previously was hidden, behind like a super over aggregated data. Like it's like going from, and I'm gonna, you're all gonna cringe at this analogy, trust me, but it's like going from standard definition to high definition TV. Suddenly I can read the values on the steering wheel of a Formula One car from the in-car footage. Right. It's, suddenly where I used to think, my 99th on this service is, a couple hundred milliseconds. That's fine. Now I'm actually seeing like bimodalities where there's like a group of requests that are like 30 milliseconds and a group of requests that are 300 milliseconds. And I never knew that about these services before. I think it's fascinating.
Maybe we can link to the blog post about this in the show notes, because it's kind of hard to this, or maybe we can put this in as video if there's a video version of this, but it's kind of hard to describe this through audio, but it's really brutally obvious if you just see an old and a new image. Just as you say, like the fidelity of the data is so much higher, and humans are visual animals. Like the highest performance data path we have to our brains is the visual cortex.
And for the listener, I was manically waving my hands around when I was explaining how excited I was about this, but obviously I realize this is not a video recording, right? So you have no idea what I'm doing there.
The only thing I would add is that not only is it easier to configure, you basically don't have to configure much at all anymore, and higher resolution, it's also way, way cheaper at the same time. It's way more efficient than the old histograms, because a whole histogram sample can be stored in one time series versus many, like one for each bucket. And then also the encoding of that sample is very efficient binary, and it's it's all very well managed and very efficient, and so it's just better on every dimension. It's amazing.
But I mean, and also the usability of it, right? Well, we talked about the query language and PromQL, the way you interact with these histograms. You don't need to know the ins and outs of what the LE label means. You don't need to make sure when you aggregate them, you propagate the LE label. And like, I've already lost most of the listeners by saying aggregate and propagate the LE label, right? You don't have to do that anymore. It just works.
The PromQL looks almost exactly as before with traditional histograms, except simpler. You just have to remove some things and suffixes and LE labels and stuff, and it just still works, and it just looks simpler than before, and it works better. It's amazing.
Yeah, that just sounds like too good to be true. What's the process like for coming up with that? Is this just like someone makes a proposal from the community, or is this like core team working on this?
We have a person who's very special called Björn Rabenstein, and he comes up with very well thought through things every time he comes up with anything. And he researches everything very deeply, and he thinks through every potential pitfall and avenue and so on. And so he was the main driver initially behind coming up with this new kind of exponential sparse bucket histogram, and then also how to make it work with a pull-based model where you cannot reset the histogram anytime a Prometheus server just pulls from a server, because that's like a GET request, should be idempotent. And yeah, I think like he was the main architect, and then other people joined, and yeah, he wrote like a large proposal and lots of other documentation around it and gave talks and so on. So
it's been a multi-year project of Bjorn's, right? Like he's been working on it probably for the best part of 5 years. Like, and the thing I really, on one level, sparse bucket histograms, even exponential sparse bucket histograms is a well-known kind of concept, right? But the nuance in detail of how it's implemented in Prometheus and the end-to-end thinking, like of getting it working in the client libraries, in the exposition format, in the storage layer, in the query language, that's where Bjorn's really excelled, right? That's where the team has really done like a really good job, and why it's taken them like a fair amount of time to work out all of those details. So you mentioned some changes in the query language to support histograms there, like and having to tweak some of the queries, and that's one of the kind of, let's call them, breaking changes in Prometheus 3.0. What are the other what other breaking changes should people be aware of, and what else is kind of maybe gonna catch you out if you just blindly swap your 2.0 binary for a 3.0? Anyone? I've got one.
Go ahead, because there were so few that were actually relevant that I forgot about all of them, and I would have to look them up.
I will say there were very few. Like it was the change in the behavior of the sliding window inclusion. That one broke a load of our alerts in production.
Where nobody thought about it beforehand, but then people were using it in a very specific way that you didn't anticipate. Yep.
This was one of those 100% like, it wasn't really intentional that it was like this, and everyone just relied on the semantics and previous behavior. And then the change also, I don't think when we made this change, we were expecting it to be so impactful, right? But we literally had to develop tools to analyze all our customers' alerts and their data, and then be able to proactively tell them, oh, by the way, this alert's going to change. This is the upgrade date, and this is how this is how we need to fix the alert for you. And we had to go and do all of that for our customers, because like it actually had this kind of unintended side effect. But it was worth it. The new behavior is much better.
Yep, exactly. And I think, other than that, there were not big things. If you go to Prometheus.io and you search for migration, there's a migration guide to Prometheus 3, and it lists a bunch of, flags and configuration settings that if you're using them, you have to change or remove or so on. But they're very minor things, and they're maybe, have been deprecated for a while already and so on. So, just go through those if you have not upgraded yet. But don't worry about like big things breaking, basically.
So tell me what's coming. When can we expect Prometheus 4.0? Is it going to be another 7 years, Julius?
I have no idea. Does anyone know? I don't think we know yet. I think we want to be pragmatic about it. We want to strike a balance between bumping the major version, every year or so, and waiting for another 7 years. I think that was maybe a bit too long. But whenever there are enough features kind of accumulated that would necessitate breaking something, we will just get together and discuss and say like, oh yeah, it's worth cutting a 4.0. That's how I would imagine this would go, but there's no concrete plan around that yet.
What I know one of the things the team's working on a lot is new governance structure. Like what's the ideas there, Richi? Like what are we trying to do with Prometheus governance?
So that's one of the things where we learned from OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry has a very, very open and inclusive governance where the threshold of contribution to become a member of standing or voting member in the terminology of OpenTelemetry is the bar of entry is very low. And this leads to an effect where basically you can defend to your manager or your spouse much more easily investing time in this thing, because you like have a stamp of official approval, and obviously you also feel better about yourself if you have something of standing. So the likelihood of those people staying around and then doing more overtime and contributing more is higher. There, Prometheus has a pretty high bar. We've lowered it already quite substantially. Basically, anyone who is a maintainer of anything not even that major is already Prometheus team member. But that is the main design goal behind the change of the governance. There's bits and pieces which are also, but like not super relevant for here. The main thing is we want to really broaden the scope of who can call themselves a member of Prometheus, to just widen the contributor base massively.
Yeah, I think even I qualify to be a member of the OpenTelemetry community, and I don't think I've contributed for years. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to expanding the kind of Prometheus community even further and making it even more inclusive. Like, I think that should be a really big desire. I don't know whether we'll call that a 4.0 feature though, right? Does that translate into a major release maybe?
No. We can do that without. We should not wait. We should not have to wait until 4.0 for that.
No, of course, yeah. What else? What other ideas do you have for future work on Prometheus?
So obviously, a lot of the things that we have just talked about are still in their early stages. UTF-8 support, for example, does not exist in every ecosystem component in client library yet, and other, systems that deal with Prometheus-like data. So that has to percolate to the entire ecosystem and be adopted everywhere. We want to add better OpenTelemetry compatibility and features to make monitoring work better with OpenTelemetry, right? Like, for example, which OpenTelemetry resource attributes to map into Prometheus target labels, like which attributes should be automatically attached to every metric on a ingested metric, basically from a OTel resource. There's already some configurability about that, but still a lot of discussion. And yeah, how to basically graft together those two different monitoring models in a way that just feels more natural and does what people would expect it to do. Native histograms still need to be stabilized. And yeah, I think other than that, can other people think about like big new things coming?
So the one thing which is also going to come harkens back to what Matt said earlier, the text format. There, Prometheus has always had a text exposition format, because that's how data was transmitted. Then between CNCF and Prometheus team, we wanted to create a standard for this at the request of CNCF as a distinct project, and this has now been merged back into Prometheus. So for those who have heard the name OpenMetrics, that is merged back into Prometheus, and there is a working group which defines a 2.0, which also is working on honing more of the native histograms and other bits and pieces, and it's actually not driven by myself anymore. It's Bartek, also Prometheus team member, who now mainly drives this. And this is also one of the things which might trigger a 4.0 or just flows with everything else, because it should be able to, or we should be able to just do it without any breaking changes. So
yeah, normally a new format would just, the Prometheus would send a header saying, I also support this new format now. If you can speak it, please speak it to me. Otherwise, the target can send an old format still. So that should not break anything.
And I think there's a small team of people from a bunch of different organizations working on a better kind of more cloudy storage format for Prometheus, right? Isn't there? I forgot the name of the Apache data format that's columnar. What's it called?
Was it Arrow?
Parquet?
Parquet?
Yeah.
I think that's how you would pronounce it. Yeah. Parquet or Parquet?
Yeah, I think I know there's a couple of people from Grafana Labs working with people from, is it Shopify, or I don't know exactly, but yeah, like working on maybe a newer storage format using Parquet that maybe, it's super early days, right? But maybe might even be even more efficient and cost effective and performant and scalable and all the ilities, basically. Julius, what's your opinion on that effort?
I have no idea about that effort. I just Googled that effort and it seems to exist. There's a GitHub repo for it. There's a Prometheus-community/Parquet dash working group, or WG. And yeah, so there's people working on that. I have no idea how far along it is. It's from some thoughts I heard about this kind of effort a long time ago is that, of course, the challenge is, you expect this to eventually work much better than what we currently have, but it's a lot of work to get over that initial hump of, initially it will not work as well. And then, it's basically, getting over that hump until it actually, works well and is worth it. So let's see how that goes. I have no insight into that.
So there is a conference, isn't there, for Prometheus? If people want to actually attend in person, in real life.
Turns out in person is kind of nice.
Tell me about it, Richi. When's PromCon?
So PromCon is going to happen in October this year. It's going to be back in Munich. So depending on who you ask, it's coming back home. Some of the Prometheus team live in Berlin, and yeah. No, I mean, snark between Prometheus team members aside. This October, we will have PromCon in Munich again, which is the PromCon which, like, the first big one happened in Munich. So for a lot of people, it tends to be like the first major one.
I love Munich. Great film.
Yeah.
Do you know what date that is, Richi?
Yes, but let me actually look it up. I think it's 21st and 22nd of October. Yes, it's 21st and 22nd of October. And the 23rd is going to be the Prometheus Dev Summit, where we basically get together and talk about all the things which go into Prometheus 4.
Richi, your memory is really good. Would you like to come to Vegas with me?
Not really. It's way too hot.
I appreciate the honesty. Imagine him he just says no if you invite him somewhere. It's nice. You know where you stand with Richi, don't you?
Normally slightly below him because he's very, very tall.
Yes, but it's very gentle. I'll just say that as well. Hopefully that makes it into the edit.
Hopefully the me going and getting a parcel doesn't.
Well, that's it. We should do our new regular section. We need a little theme
do we want
song
the
for this.
reveal of what was in the parcel?
What's in Tom's parcel?
Wait, it's gym equipment, gym clothes. I know. I go to the gym now. I'm one of those people. I do apologize. I've got what happened is I got old, and it turns out you lose muscle when you get old. So
Yep.
Well, that sucks. Well, Prometheus isn't too old, and I've got plenty of muscle left.
That is the best segue I've heard. Thank you, Matt.
Anything else we want to chat about before I do a wrap up?
No, I think we've had everything we wanted to. Thank you, both of you.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to our guests, Richi, Julius, and of course to my co-host. If you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with your team or your friends if you've got
Or your
friends.
parents.
I don't know about parents. But it depends on your parents, honestly. Some parents are cool, aren't they? So they won't be interested. But you might have nerdy parents who, might care about this. Well, we'll find out. And hopefully you join us again next time on Grafana's Big Tent.